By means of an introduction, I'm an associate director at Turner and Townsend. I am also part of the MMR, or the Mid Mobilization Review team, for Warm Homes local grants. So I have been working on this for a few months now with some grant recipients. And I'm very excited to talk about our process, as well as how we have tried to adapt the process with some learnings that we have got from the department, as well as from our grant recipients over the course of the last few months. All right, so the agenda of today is to talk about what exactly is an MMR, why it's needed, how RISE supports and the review process, as well as key documents, preparation guidance for grant recipients, what kind of tools and templates we actually use within the MMR team, how we recommend preparing for a good MMR, steps that typically follow post an MMR, and how they support you to ensure that you're ready for the DAC or the delivery assurance. Insights from practice provide additional context beyond this conversation. To start with the introduction and the purpose of the MMR, or the Mid-Mobilization Review, is a checkpoint for all grant recipients that are participating in the Warm Homes local grant program. Essentially, it is a desktop review of all the documentation that a GR is expected to submit for the delivery assurance check, which is directly with the department. It is intended to check the progress of the GR towards their DAC delivery or their DAC assessment. However, it's not intended to be a performance assessment. Since it's a desktop review, we typically review documents which are work in progress and share feedback on how a GR can actually increase the quality of the documents based on what the expectations of the department are likely to be. We do strongly recommend that any GR subscribe to a mock DAC or avail the opportunity, because this would actually, in a way, imitate the process that the department is likely to follow. We also have typically a lot of learnings as GRs mature from an MMR stage to a mock DAC stage and then to a DAC stage. So in a mock DAC, we actually get the opportunity as RISE team members to give more direct feedback through a one-on-one conversation with a grant recipient. So we strongly recommend that GRs actually go for the mock DAC, which is more of an assessment with additional recommendations, which form part of more of the desktop review of the MMR. The reason why an MMR matters is because it assesses progress towards DAC readiness. We also take great care to identify areas for improvement before delivery begins. Most importantly, this is to assess readiness for the DAC, and it is a compliance step which essentially allows the department to avoid conversations at a much more mature stage, where they would expect grant recipients to at least have a certain level of maturity in their documents as well as their delivery plan to actually pass the DAC and not have too many revisits to actually update their documents. More importantly for us, it also gives an opportunity to share feedback with tailored guidance and support. So we will specifically be able to identify areas where a grant recipient, in our opinion, might need extra support to get their documents ready for a DAC and to put together a plan for progress. And based on the guidance that we provide, the recommended support, as well as the performance assessment, we're also able to set a realistic timeline for the DAC. So typically in an MMR, as well as a mock DAC outcome report, we would share what, in our opinion, would give enough time for a grant recipient to make the necessary changes to ensure that they're as ready and as prepared for the DAC as the department would expect them to be. So the role of RISE in this review process is to act as a critical friend. Once we have received the documents submitted, we typically conduct a document review and share feedback in the form of a report within 3 working days. We identify specific opportunities for additional RISE support, which could be in the form of a one-to-many session, such as this masterclass. There could also be opportunities or recommendations for one-to-one support. Typically, the support that's one-to-one is offered by our subject matter experts who have a lot of experience working with other grant recipients as well. And we also share our findings with the department. This typically helps GRs prepare for the DAC It also allows us to share feedback with the department based on our understanding of typical areas that GRs may be struggling with, not necessarily in the form of their preparedness, but potentially in the form of additional transparency or communication that might be beneficial from the department to actually allow the GR to have more context before they go for their delivery assurance check, which is the DAC. So the intention is to offer constructive feedback and support. And I genuinely hope that the GRs also feel this way when they sit for both their MMRs as well as their mock DAC assessments. So as part of the MMR process review, going into a bit more of detail, once the documents are submitted by the grant recipient, RISE assesses the documents. We share feedback and RAG ratings, which are purely red, amber, green ratings, along similar lines as what the department would share once they have conducted the final DAC. Alongside these RAG ratings, we also share additional feedback, which can typically include examples of what we would recommend GRs incorporate into their documents to actually increase the RAG rating of their documents. We also identify support, as I had mentioned in the previous section, which was either one-to-one support or one-to-many support, which is typically tailored to each document's needs. We share internal feedback with our team as well, whose responsibility it is to actually identify and recommend support to the GRs so that they have an understanding of exactly what are the areas where the GR could most benefit from support, and accordingly that's provided. Following this, we give GRs an opportunity to re-review and update the documents based on the MMR feedback and the RAG ratings, and then potentially they could choose to sit for a mock DAC, which in our opinion would be the final preparation step before the formal DAC, which would be conducted in the form of a one-on-one interview or conversation between a reviewer, such as myself and a grant recipient. This would allow potentially an opportunity to kind of replicate the questions that we believe the department would ask based on the evaluations and the feedback that the department has shared with other GRs and the evaluation criteria we understand that they're following, but also an opportunity for us to share specific feedback, which potentially may still be lacking between the update the GR makes to their documents from the MMR to the mock DAC. So they can actually take their documents a bit further along the maturity scale so that they are absolutely as prepared as possible before the final delivery assurance check. Key documents and preparation guidance include essentially the documents that RISE would be reviewing. There's a fraud risk assessment, which essentially identifies 5 key fraud risk pillars, of which there are several examples also which are provided, but typically these are scheme processes administration, customers, beneficiary, properties, which could include identifying or verifying whether a property actually exists or not. So the range of risks that are likely to be identified should ideally be covered across all of these 5 key pillars. And these could range from the start of the scheme, pre-eligibility checks right after the point of delivery, and invoice payment of the installers or the suppliers. The other document, which is quite detailed, is a fraud management plan. The document draft or the format that is provided by the department typically goes through many rounds of updates as the department moves from one scheme to the other. So particularly for grant recipients which may have delivered schemes such as HUG in the past, they may have expectations from the department to actually review their documents, such as fraud management plan, and actually make the necessary changes to indicate a level of maturity and learnings from other programs that they have then incorporated into their future planning for Warm Homes Local Grant. So the FMP and the FRA are definitely 2 documents which have seen an increase in the degree of maturity that the department expects from the GRs across the course of these several programs. And the fraud management plan describes a very detailed approach that the GR is expected to follow, along with alignment with organizational policies which are already in existence, as well as changes that they are making which are specific to the scheme delivery at question. In addition to this, there's also a delivery assurance check form, which captures information such as escalation contacts for the purpose of flagging risks, ensuring that they are dealt with appropriately and that there is a process in place to deal with them, which would be covered in the fraud management plan as well. Project resourcing, the status of contractor procurement, delivery forecast, and eligibility verification. Typically, contractor procurement and delivery forecasts are also looked at in a significant amount of detail in the DAC form. So there's a certain level of checks and expectations that the department has, which as RISE, we would try to replicate to allow very specific feedback to the grant recipients. An example of this could be ensuring that the delivery forecast is actually steady enough to be achieved before the end of the program to accommodate for any kind of delays in implementation. As far as contractor procurement goes, a DAC stage would typically be perceived by the department as a final delivery assurance check, which would mean that a grant recipient would be strongly recommended to have the procurement completed and evidence of the procurement in place for them to actually have approval from the department to begin delivery. The documents are likely must align with the local grant framework and demonstrate readiness for delivery. And this is typically where the documents are verified against the prescribed evaluation formats that the department also uses. In terms of document expectations, we would expect them to be clear, complete, and aligned with the scheme requirements. Full readiness may not be achieved at MMR stage, and it is also not expected typically, which is why a mock DAC is an important stage in the steps towards delivery of the DAC or towards preparation towards successful DAC delivery, because we would expect a grant recipient to increase their level of maturity between the MMR and the mock DAC. As I mentioned, grant recipients typically anticipate follow-up actions between both the MMR and the mock DAC and following the mock DAC in the build-up to the final DAC with the department. As far as preparation tips go, we recommend starting early and planning ahead, using learnings from previous projects as well, using multiple layers of internal reviews to check for completeness and alignment, and assigning clear responsibilities within the team for each document. More so because the department also expects the owners of these documents to be specified in the fraud management plan, not just for the purpose of DAC preparedness, but also for the entire delivery of the scheme. So it's important to have these things as well as a process put in place. And then most importantly, to take advantage of all available opportunities to review your documents based with the RISE team and try to accommodate their feedback to improve the quality and the standard of the documents. In terms of tools and templates, these are the tools and templates that are used internally by the RISE team. To support the process, we have a few different documents and forms that we review, such as an MMR booking tracker, which is used to schedule and track MMR as well as mock DAC sessions. We have a CFR form, which is completed by our team to document the review. And feedback from the CFR form is then consolidated into a reporting template, which summarizes findings and recommendations, and is then put into a CRM system, which is used by our MMR team to manage submissions and updates, and then eventually to generate the report, which would be shared by the grant recipient at the end of both the MMR as well as the mock DAC. This feedback is shared in the form of PDF report, which summarizes the outcomes of the MMR. It also gives a RAG rating for each of the documents which are submitted, as well as the different aspects of the DAC form, which GR is expected to input. And it also gives recommendations for improvement, as well as some examples and suggestions on how we think a GR can improve the standard or the quality of their documents. As I've mentioned, the mock DACs also serve as a maturity step for an additional check on the road to a final DAC between an MMR and the final DAC. And it also further helps grant recipients refine their documentation and test their own readiness when it comes to DAC submission. The critical friend review is intended to be a supportive and a non-judgmental process by RISE to help GRs improve their documentation. I think also to add, it's most importantly based on collective feedback that RISE receives from GRs who have already completed their DAC and have received feedback, as well as continuous feedback that we received from the department based on the quality of the GRs that have already sat for their DAC, as well as the documents that they submit. So it's an opportunity to use the collective information that RISE has access to improve the quality and standard of your documents as you are preparing for your DAC. As I mentioned, there's a RAG rating system which indicates whether you're green, amber, or red, and how much improvement exactly would be expected for you to achieve green, say based on whether you are categorized as red, which is completely not ready, amber with moderate improvements. And beyond these ratings, we also share quite detailed feedback, which would hopefully make it clear as to why a GR has scored either a red or an amber on a particular category of the documents. What if a GR receives a red? I think understandably, it could be a bit of an alarm if a grant recipient has put in quite a lot of work and they unfortunately might receive a red, whether it be in the mid-mobilization review or in the mock DAC. But we intend for this to be an opportunity to improve by offering targeted assistance by RISE. And this could be, as I mentioned, in the form of one-to-one or one-to-many support. Typically, if a GR receives a red in an MMR, GRs are encouraged by their DSMs to revise and undertake a mock DAC in preparation for the final DAC. In both the MMR stage as well as the mock DAC stage, as I had mentioned previously, the RISE team also provides recommended or suggested DAC date based on the perceived readiness between these documents. So ideally, if you have updated your documents based on MMR feedback in the lead up to your mock DAC, you should be recommended a much closer DAC date as compared to what the MMR had suggested. It is very normal and very expected for scores to vary between the MMR and the mock DAC or even the final DAC. The reason behind that is, speaking as on behalf of RISE, MMRs and mock DACs are intended to be very different stages of assessment of a maturity of a grant recipient, with the mock DAC being a much more detailed and rigorous review. And the intention is to prepare a grant recipient for questions as well as concerns that the department may bring up during the final DAC. Preparing for a good MMR. Most importantly, it's good to consider the changes that the department has recommended based on different schemes that they have deployed in previous years. And they have done that in the form of updating templates for fraud risk assessment as well as fraud management. We strongly recommend using this because it's also part of the evaluation criteria that the department uses. Document preparation can definitely begin early to allow time for internal review and refinement. It's also recommended to treat the MMR as a draft stage, using the feedback from the MMR stage to improve documents ahead of the mock DAC. Procurement documentation can typically be missing from the DAC form, but it is recommended to have this in place for the final DAC, and as I had mentioned, for procurement to be finalized. During the MMR and during the mock DAC, it's also recommended to give information about procurement, which is in process, because the feedback or the recommended or suggested date for your DAC will also be based on the stage at which your procurement is at. So if it is not yet completed or if it's not yet finalized, it would be useful to share this information in the requisite section in the DAC form. The DAC form also expects escalation contacts and delivery roles to be identified. These are some tips on preparation of a good MMR. There's additional support pathways, which are also listed for GRs, as I've mentioned a few times. There can be one-to-one, one-to-many, or a both types of support similar to this session. These are typically scheduled by the RISE team or CRM based on the recommendations that an MMR or mock TAC reviewer might give you might input into the CRM as they are generating your report. This would also be indicated in your MMR as well as your mock TAC feedback, whether you have been given a specific recommendation, for example, for one-to-one support to improve your fraud management plan. The specific reasons and the specific levers of support to actually help you improve your FMBA quality would be mentioned as part of your MMR feedback or your mock TAC. Post MMR steps and delivery readiness. I think at this stage, maybe more of a recap because I have touched upon this previously. Once a GR has received their MMR feedback, they would be expected to review and act on the MMR feedback to strengthen the documentation and address recommendations. Ideally, they would want to sign up for a mock TAC, which would allow them to rehearse test readiness and also identify final gaps. Again, because it's intended to be a higher degree of maturity of assessment as compared to the MMR. The GR would then, based on mock TAC feedback and the report, get the opportunity to review and update documents again and go ahead and schedule their formal DAC. Once the DAC has actually been conducted, in all likelihood, the department may share some additional areas of improvement. In that case, GR might be able to come back to RISE and ask for one-to-one support, which would be provided by a subject matter expert. There would also be additional opportunities for peer learning as well as for additional training through available RISE resources. And finally, some insights from practice based on, I would say, a collective input of the RISE team that is working on MMR reviews. Some GRs do tend to underestimate the time needed for mobilization of all of these documents because the department's expectations have definitely evolved as compared to previous programs. Stronger documentation typically correlates with smoother delivery, which I don't necessarily think should come as a surprise to anybody who is a GR. Collaboration within teams and with RISE is key to success because we are intended to be your critical friends. So if there's any additional support that we can offer you, we would be extremely happy to provide it. GRs typically also, especially with Warm Homes Local Grant, have been seen to struggle, particularly with fraud documentation. Part of this is also because the department with this project has increased the level of checks and due diligence that they are conducting with preparation of both the FRA as well as the FMP. So our feedback as well as our assessment of both these documents during the mock TAC process has been much more thorough. And this has been an evolving process which we have incorporated to our review over the course of the last few months, from the start of the first few sets of MMRs to the ones that we have delivered most recently. So it's definitely a learning experience for us as well, and we're happy to support and clearly outline assessment, deterrence, and mitigation from the start in order for GRs to actually be more confident on their way to their DAC. And that should cover an MMR process and review.